Now I don't know about you guys, but I love me a knurled pattern on my hand tools. I don't know, it's just a nice texture to hold on to. And arguably, more importantly, it makes the tool look a lot nicer to look at. Unfortunately though, adding it to parts is arguably slowly killing my lathe. And this is the culprit. This is a cheap bump knurl tool that I bought close to 5 years ago. You know, if you go onto eBay and type in knurling tool, this is probably the first one that pops up. And the way that you use it is to simply push the tool into the workpiece and spin it in the lathe. The rollers are made of hardened steel, and that rolls, or I guess pushes the pattern into the workpiece. Now that works fine and all, except it takes a fair amount of pressure to get this working. I mean, what you're effectively doing is pushing a texture into metal. Now doing this to aluminium or brass isn't too bad, but when you start working on steel or any other material that work hardens quite a lot, you're going to run into issues because as you knurl the part, the surface does tend to harden up, and as a result, the more that you knurl it, the more pressure that you need to apply to get it to cut. The end result basically being you're applying a ton of pressure to the lathe, and arguably on these smaller end lathes like I have, the spindle bearings just aren't designed for these types of loads and you are going to be wearing them out. So as a result, I thought it was about time that I made a new one that won't slowly destroy my lathe, which I guess is a basic requirement. Now the design that I ultimately settled on was a clamp style design, where all the clamping force is done by a Leadscrew. This should put minimal force through the spindle and, well, save the bearings. Now I am aware of a similar design called a scissor knurl, which seems to be quite popular. I honestly have no clue if one has a clear advantage over the other, but I haven't seen anyone make this type, so I thought it would be a bit more interesting to make this one. I also want to quickly say that I will be reusing the old knurling patterns. They seem to work quite well, so there's no need to replace them. With all that out of the way, let's get started. So now it's the end of the year, so my materials are getting a bit low, but I think I can make all of this with some offcuts from the fly press and other projects earlier in the year. So the first thing that I'll do is clean this part up and get it to its rough final dimensions, and this part here is going to be the main body. With it all cleaned up, I'm going to mill a dovetail for the roller arms to track in. The centre now needs a 10mm hole for a retaining pin. I'll then use a slitting saw to cut a slot, which will allow me to clamp down on the roller arms. And finally, I'll get some holes tapped and drilled for some screws. And that is the main body done for the moment. The next part I now need to make are the arms that will hold the rollers. Again, I'll be using a piece of offcut, and that'll also need cleaning up. I now need to machine in a matching dovetail, and it's for the best if I can get a good sliding fit between the two. And that is probably as good as a fit as I could ask for. I'll now stand the part up and I'll drill a hole for the lead screw. With that now done, I now need to remove a chunk of material on one side, and this is mostly to allow me to knurl without the far side of the tool hitting the live center or the tailstock. And instead of using an end mill to mill it all away, I'll simply drill out and cut away a bulk of it, and then come in with an end mill to clean it up. Doing it this way is a lot quicker, and it is going to save cutting tools. And that looks just about perfect. With that now done, I now need to cut it in half to create the top and bottom parts. Next, I'll mill the slots for the cutters. With that now done, I'll drill the holes for the pins which the wheels are going to spin on. I can now taper off the top and then round off the bottom. Strictly, it's not 100% necessary, but I think it makes the part look a lot nicer. And because I don't have a proper radiusing tool, I'm simply going to go in with a carbide wood router bit and machine it that way. Strictly speaking, this is a tool made for cutting wood, but if you take light enough passes and you're really careful, you can get some really good results out of it. And with that now done, those are the arm pieces done. Almost. You see, I still haven't tapped the holes for the lead screw. Now, the bottom piece is fine. I can do that with a normal M8 tap. But the top one, well, it needs a left hand, or I guess a reverse screw thread. And I need this because as I tighten or unscrew the lead screw, I want the knurlers to move towards or away from each other. And unfortunately, I don't have an M8 left-hand tap. Yet. Obviously, since I have a lathe, it's nothing that a bit of lathe time and a little bit of silver steel and a furnace can't solve. And that is our M8 left-hand tap cut, minus the flutes. Now normally I'd check the threads up against some threading wires just to make sure it was all in tolerance, but since I'm making the lead screw and the tap, I can make it all in situ and just check the fits as I go. Now the next thing I need to do is harden it. The steel is still very soft, so it needs to be quenched and then tempered. And I'm going back to using a brazing flux to protect the part from oxidizing as it gets heat treated. Last time I used a clay to try and protect it and it didn't go so well. At least with this method I know that it does work, even if it is a bit of work to clean it up. With the part now cleaned up and tempered, I'm going to grind in the square drive with a cup grinding wheel. And I'll follow that up by machining in the flutes and the cutting edge. And at this point I probably should have stopped because I'm sure you will have spotted the big mistake that I've just made. With left hand threads we are cutting in the reverse direction, and what I've done is I've cut the flutes as if I was doing this to, well, a normal tap. i.e. I put the cutting edge and the flutes on the wrong side. Now thankfully I did catch on that I was making a huge mistake here and I was about to scrap the part. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and grind in the flutes and the cutting edge by hand, and fingers crossed hope that it works. Now if it does work, this is definitely going to be a one-time use tool. Now it's definitely not the sharpest tap that I've ever made, but thankfully it does seem to be cutting. And I don't know about you, but those threads look like threads, which at the end of the day is what matters. And with everything now cut, those are the roller housings done. Now the next thing I need to make is the lead screw. It's both going to be M8, except one side is going to be left hand and the other side will be right. Now what I'm doing here is I'm using a bit of Loctite and a cap head screw to add a hex socket to the top of the lead screw. Doing it this way is a lot easier and a lot quicker than making a new rotary broach cutter and rotary broaching it. All I need now is a way to make the lead screw captive. And so far, I'm pretty happy with how the build's come out. I now need to make up some pins for the rollers to ride on. Now there's nothing wrong with the old ones, except they were held in place by an E-clip, which honestly I never used because they were a bit tedious to install and remove. So I'm simply going to remake them with a threaded end. Now, to prevent wear and galling on the parts, I am going to heat treat them and raise their hardness. This is 1045, it's medium carbon steel, so if I quench it in water, I should be able to get a high 50s, low 60s Rockwell C hardness, which is more than enough for what I need here. With the main part of the tool done, the final thing left to do is to work out how I'm going to hold it on the lathe. And I think bolting it to a tool holder is going to be the best way to do it. It just means if I were to ever change out the tool post that I'm using, I simply need to make up a new holder and then I can bolt the tool to the new holder. With everything now clamped up, I'll simply weld everything in place. And if anyone was wondering, this is a cheap 123 block that I have previously dropped, so don't be too worried about it being used here. Alright, well I think that turned out pretty great. At least once the welds were cleaned up, so you couldn't see any remnants of the welds. Definitely a lot nicer than the old one. It could probably go for some cold bluing, just to give it a bit more protection from rust, but that isn't too urgent at the moment. The important thing though is, well, let's see if it works. Now the important thing here is a lot of cutting oil and take it slowly. Okay, well that turned out looking really nice. I'd be lying if I said the knurling looked better than it used to, mostly because I am using the same patterns. But hey, this is taking a lot less force to do it, and it's not tearing the lathe apart as I do it. If that's not a win, well, I don't know what is. All in all, I had a lot of fun doing this, and at the end of the day, I came out with a really great tool. And that's about it for now. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching. See you next week.